December 5, 1941, Western Front of Moscow. The air is brittle, cutting through cloth and skin alike. The temperature plunges below -30. German soldiers of Army Group Center crouch in frozen trenches, their breath turning to ice on their scarves. The land before them is white, flat, endless, and deathly quiet. The Wehrmacht had advanced nearly 200 miles in 2 months. Villages had burned, Soviet lines had shattered. Yet here, on the doorstep of Moscow, everything had changed. The Blitzkrieg, unstoppable through Poland, unstoppable through France, now moved at the speed of a crawl. Engines froze. Oil turned to jelly. Horses, half-starved, collapsed in the snow. Across the line, through binoculars clouded by frost, German scouts reported movement. Silhouettes. Dozens of them. Tanks, it seemed thick Soviet armor rolling in formation. One after another, appearing through the mist. For the men of the 258th Infantry Division, it was a terrifying sight, a Red Army that seemed to have risen from the snow itself. But what they were seeing wasn't what it seemed. Inside Moscow, the Stavka, the Soviet High Command, was fighting a different battle, one of perception. Intelligence reports confirmed what Stalin feared most. The Germans believed Soviet defenses were collapsing. The capital might fall within days. The only thing that could stop the Wehrmacht was time to bring fresh troops from Siberia. Time for the frost to harden, time for deception. And so began one of the most elaborate illusions of the Eastern Front. In the forests north of the city, units of the 1st Moscow Workers' Militia constructed fake tank battalions out of logs, canvas, and snow. Trucks were painted with silhouettes to look like armor. Wooden barrels mimicked gun turrets. Artillery positions were dug, then covered with snow and sheets of tin. Even the tracks in the snow were carefully carved to suggest tank movement where none existed. At night, Soviet engineers installed amplifiers, crude but effective, buried beneath snowdrifts. They played recordings of tank engines, troop movement, and artillery convoys, all carefully synchronized to match the illusion. To the frozen German observers on the opposite ridge, it looked and sounded like endless reinforcements arriving at the front. By dawn, the deception had done its work. German field intelligence units logged large armored concentrations near Istra. Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes, hindered by snowstorms and poor visibility, confirmed the sight of multiple Soviet tank battalions stationed east of the line. Panic spread among frontline officers. The Red Army, they thought, had more reserves than anyone believed possible. In truth, the Soviets were near collapse. Ammunition was scarce. Many soldiers had no winter coats. Yet from the German trenches, none of that was visible. All they saw was motion, sound, shadows, and it began to alter their plans. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commander of Army Group Center, hesitated. His troops were exhausted, frostbitten, and undersupplied. If the Soviets truly had reserves, another push toward Moscow could mean annihilation. He ordered several divisions to pause, regroup, and await clearer reconnaissance. It was the delay the Soviets needed, a pause measured in hours but worth everything. Behind the false front, General Zhukov's newly arrived Siberian divisions were assembling real tanks this time, real men hardened by colder winters than this. The deception had bought them a breath of time. By the night of December 6th, the illusion had fully taken hold. German radio intercepts described massive Soviet reinforcements. Commanders demanded artillery support before any renewed attack. The once confident invaders now hesitated in the snow, their morale breaking under frost and fear. Then, as dawn approached, the wind changed, carrying the low roar of engines again. But this time, the sound wasn't from hidden speakers. The real Red Army was moving. And for the first time since the invasion began, it was moving forward. December 6, 1941, 5:30 a.m. The horizon east of Moscow glows faintly blue. The snow reflects the pale light of a moon half hidden behind clouds. In the frozen silence, German sentries listen, not to the rumble of fake tanks this time, but to the distinct thunder of real ones. The earth trembles beneath their boots. Then the darkness erupts. Artillery flashes stab through the snowstorm. Shells scream overhead. The Red Army, silent for weeks, has begun its counteroffensive. From the forests near Klin to the frozen river at Kalinin, Soviet guns open fire in perfect unison. Rockets from BM-13 Katyusha launchers streak through the dawn, their eerie wailing echoing across the valley, a sound German soldiers will later describe as the scream of hell itself. The illusion of the ghost army had held for just long enough. Now the real army stepped out from behind it. For weeks, Soviet engineers and camouflage units had hidden their preparations. Supply convoys moved only at night, their headlights masked. Siberian troops, recently transferred from the Far East under the command of General Ivan Panfilov, arrived in secret, their winter gear unmatched by anything the Germans possessed. When the attack order came, the Germans never saw them coming. In the sector north of Moscow, the 316th Rifle Division, mostly Kazakh and Kyrgyz soldiers, surged from their snow-covered foxholes. Machine guns rattled. Bayonets flashed. The Germans, stunned and half-blind from the storm, stumbled back. Within hours, villages thought lost forever, Kryukovo, Istra, Yakrama, became battlefields once again. Panfilov's men fought with a ferocity that shocked even Soviet commanders. At the village of Dubosekovo, a small platoon held its ground against German tanks until the last man fell. Their stand would later become legend, the Panfilov 28. Whether myth or truth, it symbolized the new mood sweeping the Red Army. Moscow would not fall. Meanwhile, General Georgy Zhukov, recently recalled from Leningrad, directed the counteroffensive from a bunker beneath the capital. His strategy was precise, ruthless, and born from the deception that had bought him those crucial days. Using the illusion of ghost divisions, Zhukov had convinced the Germans to overstretch their lines. Now he struck at their weakest points, flanks thinned by false assumptions. The Germans expected a static defense. Instead, they met a wave of mobile attacks supported by fresh Siberian armor. By midday, temperatures plunged even further. Diesel froze in tanks and men collapsed where they stood. German reports recorded cases of rifles shattering when fired. The once unstoppable Wehrmacht found itself immobilized, frozen not just by weather, but by disbelief. How had the Soviets managed to assemble so many forces so quickly? Where had they come from? Many German officers still believed most of them were fake. They were not. As dusk fell, the counter-offensive gathered momentum. Soviet cavalry, wearing white capes, charged through the snowdrifts, ghosts in the twilight, sabers drawn. They struck retreating German columns, cutting through thin lines of infantry. Trucks burned, radios went silent. In some sectors, entire regiments vanished in the blizzard. In the small town of Narofominsk, German engineers tried desperately to destroy bridges before the Soviets crossed the river. But the ice held firm, and within hours, 34 tanks were rolling across, their thick armor shedding bullets like rain. For the first time, the invaders faced a weapon that could withstand both snow and shell. Each mile the Soviets regained was paid for in blood, but the psychological blow to the Germans was devastating. For months, they had believed the Soviet army was broken. Now they faced an enemy that had turned illusion into reality and deception into weaponry. By December 8th, reports reached Berlin. The enemy has launched a large-scale attack on all fronts around Moscow, read the communiqué from Army Group Center. We are under pressure. Reinforcements urgently required. But there were none. The Wehrmacht was already stretched thin across 1,000 miles of front. For the first time since the invasion of the Soviet Union, Hitler's generals began to whisper the unthinkable. The offensive toward Moscow had failed. The Ghost Army as deception had achieved what steel and fire alone could not. It had slowed the German advance, long enough for the Red Army to strike back. And now, in the frozen forests and villages outside the capital, history was changing course. The snow kept falling that night, covering corpses, tracks, and wrecks alike. To the men on both sides, the world had turned white again, a vast, silent battlefield where reality and illusion had blurred into one. For the Germans, the question was no longer how to take Moscow. It was how to survive the winter. December 9, 1941, northwest of Moscow, near Klin, the blizzard has swallowed the land. Visibility drops to less than 20 meters. Wind howls across open fields, whipping up snow until sky and ground blend into a single gray void. German units, exhausted, frostbitten, and disoriented, stumble through it like shadows. Their retreat is no longer organized. It's survival. The Soviet counterattack has become relentless. Everywhere the Germans fall back, Soviet infantry advances, slow, methodical, unstoppable. It's no longer the chaotic defense of October. It's a disciplined, calculated offensive. The deception that once masked weakness has now transformed into strength. Zhukov's plan is working. From his command post west of Moscow, General Georgy Zhukov studies a map illuminated by a single flickering bulb. Red arrows cut into the German line, north from Kalinin, south from Tula, east from Klim. His staff officers crowd around, breath visible in the freezing air. Reports pour in. German divisions in disarray, units encircled, supply lines collapsing. Zhukov nods once, then gives a quiet order. Push them back. Do not stop until they freeze or surrender. The order spreads across the front, like wildfire. Soviet divisions, reinforced by Siberian troops from General Konev's reserves, surge forward under cover of the storm. Sled-mounted mortar fire blindly into the white void. Cavalry scouts advance ahead of tanks, marking paths with branches tied to poles. The Germans can barely respond. Their engines fail, their machine guns jam. Men fight with bare hands when their weapons freeze solid. Even field telephones go dead, the lines encased in ice. For the first time since Operation Barbarossa began, the German army is on the defensive. At the front, soldiers of the 258th Infantry Division try to hold a ruined village near Klim. They're low on ammunition, their uniforms soaked and stiff with ice. A machine gun team, 2 men who once marched confidently across Poland, now share a single blanket. One of them, Corporal Franz Müller, writes in his pocket diary, "The Russians do not stop. They come even through the snow. Their tanks appear and vanish like ghosts. I can't tell what's real anymore. That confusion, that inability to separate illusion from truth, is exactly what the Soviets wanted." Even now, the Red Army's deception units continue to play engine sounds from hidden speakers, masking the true movements of real tanks behind artificial noise. When the Germans retreat, they unsure whether they falling back from real divisions or phantoms made of snow and sound. Fear turns retreat into collapse. Further south, near Tula, German armor under General Heinz Guderian attempts to regroup. The famed panzer commander, frustrated and half-frozen, writes in his journal that his units have lost over half their tanks, not to enemy fire, but to cold. The oil congeals, the engines die, the men cannot feel their hands, he notes bitterly. The Russians are fighting in their element. We are not. By December 10th, Guderian's spearhead halts completely. The dream of reaching Moscow, the heart of the Soviet Union, dies on the road to Tula, buried under ice and failure. In Moscow itself, life teeters between despair and defiance. Civilians dig trenches by hand. Women sew winter uniforms from curtains and old coats. Yet as word spreads of the counterattack, something changes. For the first time in months, the people of Moscow believe they might survive. Radio Moscow broadcasts Zhukov's declaration. The enemy will be driven from our capital. Every man, every woman, every bullet counts. The city answers with silence, not fear, but resolve. By December 12th, German field commanders report catastrophic losses. Thousands of men are missing, captured, or frozen to death. Entire regiments vanish during night retreats. When dawn comes, Soviet patrols find their bodies, rifles still in hand, eyes open, snow crusted over their faces. The Wehrmacht's proud divisions, once symbols of unstoppable power, are now reduced to fragments, scattered and leaderless. The invaders who had come expecting a swift victory now face annihilation in the snow. And the Soviet ghost army, once dismissed as propaganda, has achieved its purpose. What began as a bluff has turned into a legend, an army born from illusion that helped save a city. Still, Zhukov knows the battle is far from over. The Germans are retreating, yes, but not broken. Their discipline, forged in countless campaigns, remains. If the Soviets push too far too fast, they risk overextending and repeating the same mistakes. So Zhukov orders a measured pursuit. Advance, but consolidate. Strike, but survive. The Red Army, newly awakened, obeys. By the end of that week, the once invincible Wehrmacht is pushed more than 60 miles from the gates of Moscow. The snow has claimed its first great victory, not for either side, but against human arrogance itself. For the men still standing, both German and Soviet, the realization settles in. The war will not end quickly. It has only just begun. December 13, 1941, Smolensk-Moscow Highway. The once proud arteries of the German advance are now frozen graveyards. Charred trucks litter the roadside. Horses lie stiff in their harnesses. Abandoned artillery pieces, once symbols of blitzkrieg might, are buried nose-deep in snow. Operation Typhoon, Hitler's grand assault on Moscow, has stopped dead in its tracks. In the early autumn, this same road had thundered with engines and confidence. Panzer divisions raced eastward, convinced that Moscow would fall by Christmas. The plan had been simple. Crush Soviet resistance before winter, seize the capital, and declare victory from the Kremlin. But now, in the final weeks of 1941, reality has turned against the Reich. The temperature hovers around minus 40 degrees Celsius. Fuel drums freeze solid. Oil thickens into wax. Machine parts contract until bolts snap like glass. German soldiers, dressed for a European autumn, find themselves fighting in the heart of a Siberian nightmare. The Soviets, on the other hand, are built for this world. They move through the snow with purpose, wrapped in white camouflage, sledding supplies where trucks cannot go. Soviet engineers cut new trenches overnight, their shovels clanging against permafrost, while German troops huddle in foxholes too frozen to dig deeper. By day, Red Army artillery rains fire across the front. By night, Soviet patrols infiltrate German lines, laying mines and spreading confusion. Even the soundscape of war has changed. No longer the sharp roar of tanks and planes, but the low moan of wind and distant gunfire. For the Germans, it is a sound that feels endless. Inside a makeshift headquarters near Kalinin, Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commander of Army Group Center, studies his maps in disbelief. The neat arrows of advance he'd drawn in September are now meaningless. His divisions are scattered, his lines fractured. Reports from the front are grim. The 3rd Panzer Army is in retreat. The 4th Army's left flank has collapsed. Reinforcements from the rear can't reach the front due to snow-clogged roads. Von Bock slams his fist onto the table, the ink freezing in its bottle beside him. "We are fighting ghosts," he mutters. "They appear from nowhere and strike in force." It's madness. In a way, he's right. The Soviet Ghost Army, the deception forces that once mimicked tank movements, has now merged with reality. Their fake tanks have long since given way to real ones. The illusion had done its job so well that many German officers still believe they face overwhelming numbers, when in truth the Soviets remain stretched thin. In the Kremlin, Stalin receives his morning reports. For the first time since June, they bring good news. The German offensive has been halted. Soviet counterattacks are pushing the invaders west. The Ghost Army's trickery, an operation born of desperation, has become a model for future deception campaigns. Stalin, grim and expressionless, signs off on a new directive. Expand all Maskirovka operations. Every front, every division. Let the enemy see what we wish them to see. This word Maskirovka, meaning camouflage, deception, and misdirection, will become a cornerstone of Soviet warfare for the rest of the war. It was here, in the snows of 1941, that the doctrine took shape, not from strength, but from survival. As the Red Army presses its advantage, German morale collapses. Letters home, written by candlelight in freezing dugouts, tell the same story. "We have no coats. The wind cuts through every seam. The Russians attack without end. I can no longer tell if they are men or shadows." Private Ernst K., 10th Panzer Division. "Command says we will regroup soon, but there is nowhere left to go. The roads are ice, the tanks are dead. The only thing moving is the snow." Corporal Helmut W., 258th Infantry Division. By mid-December, German casualties exceed 130,000 since the beginning of Operation Typhoon. Thousands more are frostbitten, their limbs turning black in the cold. Entire divisions are forced to abandon their vehicles and march west on foot, boots cracking. Rations gone. Discipline dissolving in the blizzard. Meanwhile, Soviet propaganda seizes the moment. Radio broadcasts from Moscow speak of victory, of the Red Army pushing back the invader. Loudspeakers at the front blare patriotic music across no man's land, a cruel soundtrack to German despair. Yet for all the triumph, Zhukov knows his position remains fragile. His troops are exhausted, his supply lines thin, his equipment strained. The Soviet winter may be their ally, but it's also an enemy that kills indiscriminately. Every night, hundreds of Red Army soldiers freeze to death in the same snow that buries their foes. Still, Zhukov presses on. "The Germans have lost their momentum," he tells his staff. "We must not lose ours." By December 16th, the tide is unmistakable. Operation Typhoon, once Hitler's dream of total victory, is over. The Wehrmacht is in full retreat along the entire front near Moscow. The snow has consumed men, machines, and morale alike. From the air, reconnaissance photos show the German lines fracturing like cracks in ice, each break a symptom of fatigue and disbelief. The ghosts of Moscow, once illusions made of plywood and sound, have become real in the minds of the enemy. And as the Soviets advance, one brutal truth emerges from the blizzard. The greatest weapon of the Russian winter is not the cold. It's the illusion that the Red Army cannot be beaten in it. By mid-December 1941, the advancing German forces of Operation Typhoon found themselves trapped not only by the Russian winter, but by an enemy whose very appearance promised more than it could sustain. What the Germans observed, armored columns, artillery concentrations, fresh infantry units, was only in part real. What they feared was far greater than the Red Army's visible strength. The Soviets had mastered the art of deception, masked in cold and snow, and it dealt the Wehrmacht a blow before the battle of strength truly began. Far to the rear of the frontline trenches, teams of Soviet engineers, artists, camouflage units, and speakers labored through darkness and frost. Wooden frames shaped like tanks were placed on ridges. Canvas covers draped over trucks created false silhouettes of heavy armor. Speakers hidden beneath drifts of snow blared the noise of motors, tracks grinding, artillery firing. To the German observer, these forms merged with the real. From a distance, they looked like the reserves the Germans feared were piling up. In the frozen air and shifting light, the illusion was convincing. For the German high command, this was more than mere trickery, it was a trap. Their reconnaissance reported what seemed to be new Soviet formations arriving en masse. Commanders believed they faced an enemy with reserves they could not locate or outmaneuver. Time and again, the Germans deferred attacks, redeployed units, waited for confirmation, and in doing so they gave the Soviets exactly what they needed. Hours, then days, to bring real divisions into contact, to organize supplies, to shift forces under cover of snowstorms. The illusion had become a force multiplier. On the front, German troops sensed something was wrong. A lieutenant from a panzer regiment recorded how he saw rows of tanks through the haze, but when they advanced, several tailed off into wooded hollows, engine noise faded, tracks turned shallow. His report: "We are chasing shadows." Supplies were slow to arrive. Winter gear was lacking. The roads from the rear were clogged with wrecks, frozen corpses, and abandoned vehicles. Discipline frayed, morale slipped, and the once dominant German war machine began to feel uncertainty instead of confidence. Meanwhile, the Soviets held their reality in tension. Their real forces were still under-equipped, underfed, many without winter coats. Yet, thanks to the deception, they had bought the time to bring in fresh troops from the Siberian and Far Eastern military districts, replace lost tanks, reorganize shattered rifle divisions, and prepare for the counterblow. The cold was their ally, but the knowledge that they had fooled their enemy became a weapon in its own right. When the Germans finally realized the danger, it was too late to act effectively. The front was no longer a straight line of attack, but a shifting mosaic of false and real positions. The illusion forced the attacker into caution, into hesitation, which in winter is often defeat. The retreat began not from a shattered front, but from a front that believed it was far stronger than it was because the defender had convinced it so. By December 5-10, reports from Army Group Center noted that the enemy's defenses are growing. New formations appear where none were known. For the Soviets, this meant victory in the psychological war. The Germans had ceded initiative not just through frost but through fear. The true scale of Soviet forces still lay hidden, but the impression was all the enemy needed to falter. The German retreat through the snow deepened, not simply because of freezing, but because they believed the enemy they confronted was greater, and when belief falters, so too falls the line of attack. The Soviets' unseen army had done its job: to slow the invader, to draw caution where audacity had once ruled, and to allow forces hidden in the winter forests to deliver the counterstrike. December 5, 1941. The thermometer outside Moscow plunged to -40 degrees Celsius. The snowstorm that rolled across the plains that morning was not merely weather, it was cover. Beneath that blinding white curtain, the real Soviet army, no longer a phantom, began to move. For weeks, Stalin's command had concealed its reserves from German intelligence. From the east, thousands of battle-hardened soldiers, men of the Siberian divisions, arrived by rail, their trains camouflaged, their uniforms layered for Arctic war. These were veterans of the Far Eastern frontier, accustomed to temperatures that froze diesel in its lines. They carried new skis, fur-lined helmets, and fresh Mosin-Nagant rifles. Most of all, they carried confidence. They had not been beaten back by the Germans, and they came to deliver the first major Soviet counteroffensive of the war. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, newly appointed to defend the capital, had been quietly shifting divisions for days. His intelligence chief, General Golikov, confirmed that Japan would not attack Siberia, freeing the Far Eastern armies to be redeployed west. By the time the German commanders realized what was happening, 40 divisions had assembled along a front more than 100 miles wide. At dawn, Soviet artillery opened up near Klin, Kalinin, and Tula. Thousands of guns cracked the frozen silence, hurling shells through sleet and snow. The fake guns and wooden tanks that had guarded Moscow for weeks now stood silent behind the real ones, the illusion replaced by substance. Soviet Katyusha rocket launchers, still scarce in number but devastating in effect, howled across the sky and broke apart German defensive lines. Then the infantry advanced. The Siberian troops moved on skis, cutting across fields where German tanks could no longer maneuver. In their white camouflage suits, they seemed like ghosts themselves, spectral forms gliding over drifts, rifles flashing in the sun. To the exhausted Wehrmacht soldiers, many half frozen in their foxholes, it was as if the phantom army they had feared now took solid shape and came charging out of the storm. German units tried to hold. Field Marshal von Bock issued desperate orders to stand fast, but his troops were in no state to resist. Oil froze in tank engines, bolts jammed in rifles. Entire batteries were buried in snow. Supplies had not reached the front for days. Even the Luftwaffe was grounded, its planes unable to start in the sub-zero cold. As Soviet troops overran outposts, reports of panic spread along the line. The 3rd Panzer Army was forced to retreat from Klin. By mid-December, the Germans began abandoning the outer positions they had taken just weeks earlier. Soldiers who had once seen Moscow's distant spires now trudged backward through waist-high snow. The myth of German invincibility, which had carried the Wehrmacht from the Ardennes to Smolensk, began to crack in the bitter Russian cold. Behind them, Soviet propaganda units recorded every victory. Newsreels from the front would later show the liberation of villages, the capture of German prisoners, the raising of red banners on frozen ruins. But what those cameras could not capture was the deeper reversal. After 6 months of relentless retreat, Soviet troops were advancing and the Germans were running. By December 20th, the counteroffensive stretched over the entire Moscow sector. Kalinin was retaken. Tula was relieved. Soviet cavalry units, some still riding horses through the blizzard, cut off supply roads behind the retreating enemy. In several pockets, German regiments were surrounded and annihilated. The illusion that had once saved Moscow was now complete. Deception had bought time, and time had brought the real army. The ghosts that had fooled the Germans into hesitation were now replaced by living men, armed, determined, and driven by the fury of a nation defending its soil. But even as Soviet troops pushed forward, Zhukov understood that victory was far from absolute. The Red Army had regained ground, not supremacy. Casualties were enormous. Equipment was scarce. Yet the psychological shift was undeniable. For the first time since June, the Germans were no longer advancing. The ghost army that emerged from the snow had done more than repel the enemy. It had shattered the myth that the Wehrmacht could not be stopped. By late December 1941, the frozen steppes west of Moscow had become a graveyard of German ambition. Operation Typhoon, Hitler's final push to seize the Soviet capital, was collapsing. What had begun as a confident drive across open plains now turned into a desperate retreat through ice and mud. The Wehrmacht, exhausted and ill-prepared for the Russian winter, faced an enemy it no longer understood. For months, German propaganda had promised victory before the first snow. But now the first snow had turned to drifts taller than a man, and the Russians were no longer running. Instead, they struck from forests and villages that the Germans thought were empty. Soviet units, disguised under white camouflage, launched ambushes at dawn. German columns were shattered by artillery fire that seemed to come from nowhere, sometimes from real batteries, sometimes from decoy guns that had concealed their true positions until the final moment. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock's headquarters was inundated with chaos. His armies, the 3rd and 4th Panzer, the 9th and 4th Infantry, were breaking contact along the entire front. Telephone lines froze solid, radios failed, and couriers disappeared into the snow. Reports from the field painted a grim picture: frostbite more common than bullets, engines frozen solid, rations running out. One regimental commander recorded that his men had not eaten hot food for a week. Another wrote that his rifle bolts had to be warmed over fires before they could shoot. The once disciplined German retreat turned into a struggle for survival. Horses froze where they stood, their carcasses later used as fuel for fires. Medical trucks were abandoned because gasoline had congealed in their tanks. Wounded soldiers were left behind when the roads turned to ice. German diaries from the time record the same refrain: Cold, hunger, Furcht, cold, hunger, fear. At the same time, Soviet morale surged. In liberated villages, civilians emerged from hiding to greet Red Army soldiers with tears, bread, and salt. Propaganda leaflets proclaimed that Moscow stands and the fascists are running. Soviet cameramen followed close behind the infantry, capturing footage of captured German tanks half buried in snow. These images, broadcast across the Soviet Union, became symbols of resistance, proof that Hitler's war machine could bleed. But the victory was not without cost. Many Soviet divisions had been reduced to half strength. Frostbite claimed more lives than combat. Entire rifle regiments fought barefoot, their boots frozen or lost. Medical supplies were scarce, and ammunition shortages forced units to scavenge from abandoned German depots. Yet compared to the invader, the Soviets had one advantage: they were home, and the cold was their ally. Hitler's response was fury. On December 19th, he dismissed Field Marshal von Brauchitsch and assumed direct command of the German army. From his headquarters in East Prussia, he forbade any further retreat, issuing the infamous order: not one step back. But on the ground, those orders were meaningless. German divisions were already falling back 100 kilometers from Moscow, some without permission, simply to avoid annihilation. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers who once believed in Blitzkrieg now doubted everything: their leadership, their mission, even their survival. A corporal from the 10th Panzer Division wrote, "We are ghosts in the snow. We have no strength, no food, no hope." Meanwhile, Zhukov pressed his advantage with ruthless precision. He ordered his Siberian divisions to strike at Kaluga and Mosaisk, cutting the main retreat routes west. Armored brigades rolled forward, supported by Katyusha batteries. In several sectors, German strongpoints were surrounded and destroyed. One Soviet report described villages filled with enemy corpses frozen standing, rifles still in their hands. By New Year's Eve 1941, the offensive line of the Wehrmacht had collapsed across nearly 300 miles. The German dream of capturing Moscow was dead. The Ghost Army that had once existed as a deception now existed as a legend, a symbol of Soviet cunning, endurance, and defiance. Yet beneath the celebration, the Red Army Command understood what lay ahead. This was not the end of the war, but merely the turning of its tide. The Germans would return in spring, better supplied, more determined. But the illusion that had once fooled them, and the fear it created, had bought the Soviet Union the most precious resource of all: time. By January 1942, the battle for Moscow had shifted from motion to endurance. The German advance was broken. The Soviet counteroffensive had stalled. Between them stretched a frozen wasteland, forests stripped bare, villages reduced to blackened shells, and fields littered with wreckage. Both sides now faced the same enemy, the Russian winter. For the Red Army, the initial wave of success had come at a heavy cost. Their triumph in December owed as much to deception as to strength, but the real lesson was only beginning to crystallize. Soviet commanders realized that Maskirovka, the art of military concealment and misdirection, was not merely a battlefield trick. It was a weapon as powerful as artillery and far cheaper to employ. The Ghost Army that had saved Moscow was a spontaneous success, born of necessity and improvisation. Yet it revealed something profound about the Soviet way of war. In a battle where the Red Army was outgunned, outnumbered, and still recovering from catastrophic losses, it was deception that balanced the scales. Marshal Zhukov, reviewing the battle reports in his field headquarters at Klin, took note of how the feints, decoys, and false troop movements had shaped German decision-making. A handful of plywood tanks had drawn entire German divisions off course. Dummy artillery emplacements had forced the enemy to waste ammunition. False radio signals had convinced German intelligence that fresh Soviet armies were arriving daily. In early 1942, the Soviet General Staff began formalizing these lessons. Under the direction of the newly restructured Stavka, training manuals were drafted to codify Maskirovka as an integral part of Soviet operational planning. Officers were instructed that the success of every operation depends not only on force, but on the illusion of force. Even as fighting raged along the Urzev-Vyazma line, specialized camouflage battalions were formed. These units, composed of engineers, artists, and field technicians, were tasked not just with hiding real units, but with inventing false ones. They used wireframes, canvas, and snow to build fake tank columns, mock airfields, and decoy artillery batteries. Paint, smoke, and sound completed the illusion. Soviet Maskirovka extended beyond the battlefield. On the strategic level, the Soviets learned to move entire armies without detection, using radio silence, false transmissions, and misleading reconnaissance reports to mask redeployments. This doctrine would later shape some of the most decisive battles of the war: at Stalingrad in 1942, at Kursk in 1943, and across Eastern Europe in the final push toward Berlin. But in early 1942, those lessons were being written in blood. The front lines froze in place, and the war returned to a brutal grind of attrition. German forces, though driven back from Moscow, still held vast territory. Both sides dug in for the long fight ahead. In the shattered villages west of the capital, Soviet soldiers huddled in makeshift bunkers built from snow and wreckage. Many had fought for weeks without rest. Supplies were scarce, and frostbite remained rampant. Yet morale was higher than it had been in months. They had proven that the Germans could be beaten. Meanwhile, captured German reports confirmed how successful the Soviet deception had been. Field intelligence summaries from Army Group Center spoke of phantom divisions, endless Soviet reserves, and camouflage that defies detection. One German officer, writing after the war, would later recall, "We believed we faced an army of millions. In truth, we were fighting shadows, and they beat us." For the Soviet leadership, this was more than vindication. It was revelation. The war had begun with disaster, encirclements, collapses, and defeats on an unimaginable scale. But now, through cunning and patience, the Red Army had found a way to fight on its own terms. In Moscow, the capital that Hitler had promised to burn by Christmas stood scarred but unbroken. Factories resumed work beneath camouflage netting. Anti-aircraft guns still lined the rooftops. The city was alive, battered, proud, and burning with quiet resolve. The battle was over, but the memory of the illusion of ghost armies rising from the snow would become legend. It would mark the rebirth of Soviet confidence and the dawn of a new doctrine that turned deception into strategy, and strategy into survival. As 1942 unfolded, the lessons of Moscow began to echo far beyond the frozen front lines. The Red Army's deception at the gates of the capital had not only bought survival, it had forged a blueprint for future warfare. Across the Soviet command structure, officers studied how illusion, misdirection, and the manipulation of enemy perception could win battles before they were even fought. When the snows melted and the spring mud returned, Hitler's Wehrmacht once again prepared to strike. The new offensive would push toward the oil fields of the Caucasus and the city that bore Stalin's name, Stalingrad. Confident from the early victories of the campaign, the Germans believed the Soviets were exhausted, their defenses scattered. What they did not realize was that Moscow's Ghost Army had changed how the Red Army thought, moved, and fought. By the summer of 1942, Soviet planners had transformed Maskirovka from improvisation into doctrine. Commanders like Zhukov, Rokossovsky, and Vasilevsky ordered entire fronts to rehearse deception maneuvers. Fake bridges constructed overnight, false radio networks transmitting bogus orders, wooden aircraft lined up on empty airstrips. The goal was simple but devastatingly effective: confuse, divide, and overextend the enemy. German intelligence, still haunted by the phantom armies of the previous winter, now faced an enemy that could disappear as easily as it could strike. Reconnaissance photos showed tank concentrations that didn't exist. Intercepted Soviet radio traffic led to barren fields. At every level, the Wehrmacht's faith in its own reconnaissance began to erode. When Hitler's forces approached Stalingrad in August 1942, the Soviet command used Maskirovka on an unprecedented scale. Even as the city's defenses crumbled under German bombing, the Red Army quietly moved fresh divisions across the Volga under cover of night and smoke. Fake ferries and decoy supply depots drew Luftwaffe raids away from the real crossings. Soviet engineers flooded certain zones of the riverbank to conceal artillery emplacements beneath waterlogged camouflage. The Germans saw what they expected to see: a broken enemy too weak to resist. In truth, they were staring at a carefully constructed mirage. Inside the ruins of Stalingrad, the same deceptive tactics that had saved Moscow were reborn in miniature. Soviet snipers shifted positions daily, using dummies to lure German fire. Entire platoons vanished into cellars and re-emerged miles away through sewer tunnels. German maps, once precise, became meaningless in the maze of rubble. As the fighting dragged on into the winter of 1942-43, the Germans once again found themselves trapped, not only by the weather, but by the illusion that they still held the advantage. When Zhukov and Vasilevsky launched Operation Uranus in November, encircling the German Sixth Army, they did so under the cover of deception that stretched for hundreds of miles. Fake troop movements to the south had misled the Germans into reinforcing the wrong sector. When the real Soviet strike fell, it shattered the entire front. The ghosts of Moscow had returned, not as illusions this time, but as encircling armies. German survivors of the encirclement would later write of their disbelief. How had the Soviets moved so many troops without being seen? How had they hidden tanks and artillery in plain sight? The answer, once again, was Maskirovka, a doctrine born in desperation but refined into mastery. The victory at Stalingrad was more than a turning point of the war. It was the ultimate validation of deception as a weapon. The Red Army had learned that victory did not always depend on having more men or machines. Sometimes it depended on convincing the enemy that you did. By the time German resistance at Stalingrad collapsed in February 1943, Soviet commanders fully embraced Maskirovka as central to their operational art. From then on, every major Soviet offensive, at Kursk, Operation Bagration, and the final march to Berlin, would bear the imprint of that first illusion outside Moscow. What had begun as a desperate act of survival in the winter of 1941 had become one of the most sophisticated deception systems in modern military history. The world would remember the frozen soldiers, the white-clad infantry, and the burning tanks. But behind all that, the real triumph lay unseen, in the art of making an army appear where it was not, and disappear where it was. As the snow melted across the frozen fields near Moscow, the exhausted soldiers of the Red Army realized they had witnessed something beyond survival. What began as a desperate illusion had become a weapon, one powerful enough to change the course of war. After the Battle of Moscow, the deception tactics born from that bitter winter were no longer considered improvisation. They became part of Soviet military doctrine. Commanders learned that the strength of an army was not only in firepower or manpower, but in its ability to make the enemy see what wasn't there. In 1942 at Stalingrad, the Red Army used deception on a new scale. While the 62nd Army fought street by street inside the city, engineers and camouflage units built dozens of fake tank parks and artillery sites on the outskirts. Luftwaffe bombers struck at these illusions night after night, wasting tons of ordnance on wooden shapes and painted tarps. Meanwhile, real Soviet divisions were quietly moving through the forests north of the city, preparing for Operation Uranus, the counterattack that would encircle Paulus's 6th Army. A year later at Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, over 2,000 dummy guns and tanks were deployed ahead of the true Soviet lines. When the German assault began, most of their opening barrage fell on empty ground. Behind the smoke, the real Red Army lay hidden, waiting. When they struck back, the illusion paid off. The Wehrmacht's final major offensive in the east was broken. By 1945, the Soviet Union had forged a doctrine from these experiences. They called it Maskirovka, the art of concealment and deception. It combined camouflage, false intelligence, psychological warfare, and radio trickery into one coordinated weapon. During the Cold War, Maskirovka became a cornerstone of Soviet operations, from hiding missile bases in Cuba to concealing tank deployments in Afghanistan. When Western analysts finally gained access to declassified Soviet records decades later, they were astonished. NATO military academies began to study these campaigns, labeling them the art of indirect war. But perhaps the true legacy of the Ghost Army lies not in strategy, but in spirit. It proved that even in the darkest winter, human imagination can become a weapon mightier than steel. Those who built wooden cannons and sculpted tanks from snow did more than deceive the enemy, they saved a nation. Today, inside Russian military academies, the story of the Moscow deception is still taught. A reminder that in war, what you cannot see may be the very thing that destroys you. When the guns fell silent in 1945, a new kind of conflict emerged, the Cold War. And within its shadows lived the same principle that had once saved Moscow, the war of illusion. Inside Soviet academies like Frunze and Voroshilov, young officers were taught a simple creed. Victory comes not when you strike hardest, but when your enemy misunderstands what he sees. Deception, diversion, misdirection all became fundamental to modern Soviet warfare. As one general famously wrote, "If the enemy can predict our actions, we are already defeated." From 1948 to 1962, Maskirovka evolved from a field tactic into a strategic art. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, Soviet engineers disguised ballistic missiles as agricultural equipment. Launchers were hidden under jungle canopies. Radio transmissions were faked to convince U.S. intelligence that the troops remained in Europe. By the time the CIA discovered the truth, the missiles were almost operational. Maskirovka had won another battle without firing a shot. Meanwhile, in the West, echoes of the Soviet deception inspired their own countermeasures. Captured German reports from 1941 to 42 revealed how effective the Ghost Army near Moscow had been. In 1944, British and American planners built their own illusion, Operation Fortitude. Using inflatable tanks, fake aircraft, and entire radio networks transmitting false messages, they created an imaginary army poised near Dover. Its purpose? To convince Hitler that the D-Day invasion would strike Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. The deception worked perfectly. German high command kept elite panzer divisions far from the true invasion site for weeks. The success of D-Day carried the unmistakable fingerprints of Maskirovka. In the decades that followed, deception became a permanent weapon of modern warfare, from Vietnam to the Gulf War, and later, into cyberspace. Terms like PSYOPs and information warfare all trace their roots back to one truth born in the Russian snow. In war, truth is only one of many weapons. Historians today call the 1941 deception near Moscow the birth of cognitive warfare, because it was there, in that frozen landscape, that humanity first learned to fight not just with bullets, but with belief. When peace returned, the soldiers who had built the Phantom Army went home to silence. There were no parades, no medals, no songs in their honor. Their names were buried in military archives under simple titles: Engineering Detachment, Signal Unit, Logistics Group. They had fought not with guns, but with wood, fabric, and sound. For decades, the Ghost Army of Moscow was erased from memory. Their records were locked away under state secrecy, their photographs hidden from public view. Only in the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Did historians begin to uncover the truth, discovering faded blueprints, field sketches, and black-and-white photos of snow-carved tanks and wooden artillery? One name stood out among the rediscovered files: Colonel Vasily Masukov, commander of a deception group near the Kalinin front. Late in life, he gave a rare interview saying, "We were not allowed to fail. If the enemy saw through the illusion, they would attack, and we'd all be dead. Every hammer strike, every brush of paint was a gamble with your life." He died in 1982, never officially recognized for what he and his men achieved. Many of his comrades followed the same path, their contributions unacknowledged, their courage forgotten. In the 21st century, Russian historians finally pieced their story together. A few relics, wooden tank frames, fake gun mounts, camouflage nets, now sit behind glass at the Kubinka Military Museum. Visitors stop and stare, realizing these fragile props once held back the mightiest army on Earth. Every winter, as snow covers the forests outside Moscow, cadets from the Zhukov Military Academy still recount the tale, not as a legend, but as a lesson. That in the coldest, darkest days of war, there were men who chose to deceive death in order to protect life. The story of the Ghost Army is more than a footnote in history. It's proof that human strength isn't measured in muscle or steel, but in imagination, courage, and the will to survive. As one Soviet general later wrote, "We did not win because we had more guns. We won because we made the enemy believe we could not be defeated."